Good morning. Here we are, Geography of the Western World. We'll be going back to the Pacific Realm in just a few seconds. Okay, it is 9:30, so we're going to get to work here. As always, nice if any of you can put on your cameras. Here we go. So we were looking at the Pacific Realm, and we had my theme of isolation as we were doing that. So I asked you, what is the world's most isolated city? And you were to send me a paragraph in Blackboard with your answer. Yes, and some of you did. And let's look at that question then. What is the world's most isolated city? All right, so I'm going to give you my answer then to this question. What is the world's most isolated city? To do that, we have to define our terminology. So I thought about isolated. What could that mean? Perhaps the simplest way would be, yeah, how far is it to the next place? We could measure it in miles. How far is it from our city to the next settlement? However, as I thought more about this, I wondered, well, what kind of place is the next settlement? If it's 50 miles to the nearest place, and that nearest place is a village of 50 people, that probably doesn't help. Probably doesn't help me feel less isolated if there's just a tiny little place over there somewhere. So maybe I should say how far it is to the next biggest place, or at least a big place. I consider the possibility of choosing a different sort of statistic. Instead of miles or distance, choosing population density. How crowded are the places nearby? If there's just 3 people per square mile, well, that's no one, basically. So I would still feel isolated in that sort of setting. Or alternatively, maybe it's a measure of access. There are some places in the world where there are no roads that reach them. That would contribute to isolated. If you had to fly, for instance, if air was the only way to get to that place. All right, so I pondered those options, and then I thought about city. How big is a city? So 2,500 people, I said no, that is not a city. 10,000 people, I still think that's a town. Would 100,000 be enough? Probably. Would 1,000,000 be enough? Certainly, that's a city. Okay. And I decided I'm not going to count a whole metropolitan area in my measures. I'm just counting the population of the city itself. So using that, I decided on these 2 criteria. First, that the city is at least 200,000 people. So I actually used GIS, Geographic Information Systems, to find all the cities in the world that have at least 200,000 people in them. And of course, there's lots of those. But lots of those sorts of cities are pretty close to other big cities. In the United States, of course, we have quite a few big cities. There's a lot of them on the eastern side of America. And they're, well, not that far to the next big city. So I didn't feel like any US cities, at least on the eastern side, were isolated. No. All right. And then I decided that isolation would be how far it is to the next level up. That I would feel isolated until I could get to a place that had more than what I have. A city of 200,000 people has lots of features, lots of things. How far do I have to go till I get to a place that has even more, even more? So I decided that would be 1,000,000. From a city of at least 200,000 to a city of at least 1,000,000 people. Based on those two notions, the answer is Honolulu. By my definitions, Honolulu is the world's most isolated city. Makes some common sense, I think, too, because the Hawaiian Islands are way out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, long distance from anything. So it's over 2,500 miles from Honolulu to the nearest million-person city, which is Los Angeles. Okay, so maybe you suggested Honolulu was the world's most isolated city. If I ever ask you what my answer is to that question, now you know, Honolulu. However, maybe you chose different criteria for isolated and city, so you might legitimately have come up with a different answer. For instance, maybe you came up with Perth. In fact, Perth likes to say, yeah, hey, we are the most isolated city. Perth likes to make it a feature of tourism. Come to the world's most isolated city. Well, according to my criteria, Perth actually came in number 2. And it is a long way to another big city, a 1,000,000-person city. You either have to go all the way across Australia to Sydney or north to Indonesia and Jakarta. So, yeah, that would be quite a legitimate answer also. Perhaps you went to Wikipedia. Well, the odd thing there is they don't use the word isolated, they're using the word remote to think about the same thing. So they have some options for you there too. With one definition, the most remote city, is Perth. And that definition is a city of at least 1,000,000 to a city of 100,000. So it's kind of the reverse of my approach there. And to do that, yes, you go from Perth to Adelaide would be the nearest that meets that one, making Perth the most remote city in the world. But Wikipedia offers a different option by a different definition. If you take a city of at least 1,000,000 and then have to go to another city of at least 1,000,000, then they're saying that Auckland, New Zealand would be the most isolated city. Okay, so that would be another possibility. And if you take a city of at least 500,000 to another city of at least 500,000, then the answer is, well, what I came up with, Honolulu, but they got there with a slightly different approach. City of 500,000, San Francisco qualifies, and so you only have to go from Honolulu to San Francisco. All right, well, those are at least some, and maybe you came up with another answer that was quite interesting too, depending on your definitions. But what I like about the answers I've shown you is that all of them are in the Pacific realm. And the Pacific realm has my theme of isolation. So that works. That's a nice compliment there to fit. And note, odd. It is odd that Hawaii is in here because Hawaii, on the one hand, of course, is in North America because it's part of the United States, one of our 50 states. On the other hand, it is in the Pacific realm because Hawaii is in Polynesia, that set of Pacific islands, and the natives are Polynesian. So the Pacific realm. So Hawaii actually has a duality, 2 spots, dual positions in North America and in the Pacific realm. Okay. So we have now answered that question. What is the world's most isolated city? Now let's go back to where we left off with the late exploration and settlement. Late exploration and settlement. Remember, we looked at different explorers, different countries that came looking for Australia. And right near the end, we had mentioned this one, that Abel Tasman came out for the Dutch, tried to go all the way around Australia, and note how big it is. Sort of went all the way around, but didn't actually identify Australia, but did notably name New Zealand. That they then sent him back, and that he did somewhat better going there on the northwest side of Australia. Lastly, last time, we talked about the British coming out, and this man, Captain William Dampier, coming out, and that he called the natives the miserablest people in the world. Rather harsh, maybe racist, but soon I'm going to tell you a very important statement. All right, now let's go on from there. Even more famous in British maritime history, we have James Cook, Captain James Cook. And if you look at this map, you see that, yeah, this guy got around. This guy got all over the world. You can see in the blue that he went up to Alaska. Harder to note, but in the blue there, he also stopped in Hawaii. And yeah, lots of places. New Zealand, it's hard to spot New Zealand because there's so many lines nearby, but New Zealand has the blue and the red and the green lines there converging. And the blue and the green actually go through the middle of New Zealand. There is a narrow passageway of water between the two big islands of New Zealand, and that is called the Cook Strait. Again, a strait is a narrow passageway of water between two large land masses. Explorers often get their names on the map, and this one is another example, that the Cook Strait. But most important, I would say, is the red line going along the east side of Australia. Remember the landings of the Dutch? No, not on the east side. This is big. This is a first. This is going to be tremendously important. So here's James Cook, and it's 1770 when he's spending 5 months exploring along the east side of Australia. And he finds 3 remarkable features of the east side. So good harbors. Well, that's really useful. If you're exploring, if you're settling, if you're colonizing, if you're establishing trade, harbors are really valuable. And he finds several good spots on the east side of Australia. He finds coastal plains, flatlands along the coast. Well, that too, wonderful for setting up colonies, settlements, trade. Yeah, you want to be able to build, and flatlands are great for building settlements. Cool. And on this very dry continent, he finds rainfall on the east side. Well, that's pretty important too. Here's why it rains on the east side of Australia. After the coastal plains there, a little bit west of the coastal plains, there's a mountain range in Australia. It's called the Great Dividing Range. Now, these are not particularly large mountains. Compared worldwide, no, not at all big mountains. The highest is Mount Kosciuszko at over 7,000 feet. Don't worry about that name, but try to remember The Great Dividing Range is this mountain range there. So what we have is air over the ocean there. And pretty typically, air over the ocean is fairly moist air because some water evaporates from the surface of the ocean into the air above it. And coastal areas typically have wind swirling off of the ocean onto the land. So we have moist air coming off of the ocean onto the land, where there are coastal plains in this case, and then pushing forward and running into the Great Dividing Range. So like you see there in the illustration, those winds now have to go up the mountain. All right, well, it is a fact about rising air. Doesn't matter where in the world or how, but rising air always cools. Physical property of air. All right, if you take moist air and you cool it down, some of that water vapor in the air condenses and turns to liquid water. Well, lots of tiny, tiny droplets of liquid water. And clouds form. Clouds are actually millions of tiny, tiny droplets of liquid water. Well, as the air goes farther up the mountain, it cools off more condensation occurs, more drops of water, more collisions of those drops of water, and the drops of water get bigger and bigger, and eventually gravity pulls them down and we get rain. So we commonly have rain on this side of the mountains. Now, when that air and those clouds reach the top, then it changes. Now we have the opportunity to descend on the other side of the mountain. It is also a physical property of air that descending air warms. So if we have any liquid water, if we have any cloud at the top, it starts to come down and any water then evaporates as it warms up, turns into a gas, disappears, the cloud disappears, and we're going to have maybe a touch of rain, but then down the mountainside dry. So we're going to have warm, dry air on the other side of the mountain here. Wherever that happens, that is called the rain shadow. The rain shadow. And so that side of the mountain will be dry. And in Australia, we go from there onto the outback. Okay, well, this is called orographic precipitation, and it happens many places in the world. One example in our own country is in the state of Washington, where on the west side of the Olympic Mountains, we get a lot of rain. It's one reason why there's a lot of rain in Seattle. And then on the east side of those same mountains, it's quite dry. And the eastern half of Washington state is a relatively dry area. Okay, but this is great for Australia. Well, it's great for the east coast of Australia, where Cook had also said there are harbors and coastal plains. So he goes back to Britain eventually and makes his report. He's found a great place for settlement and perhaps for adding to the British Empire. The British were good at adding pieces to their empire. But remember, he was there in 1770. Well, the American colonies were beginning to become problems for Britain by 1770. And of course, soon, 1776, we declare independence. We have the American Revolution. Okay, but before that, one of the things that the British had been doing with the American colonies is they had been sending their extra prisoners here to America. In Britain, in England in particular, they had jails that were often too full. What to do with these people? Well, no one likes to have jails nearby. No one likes to have a lot of convicts nearby. And so they thought, well, we'll just send them to America. We'll send a bunch of extra convicts to America. They'll be far away. They'll probably never come back. Yeah, great. So they did. And then along came the American Revolution. And we won and became a new country. And that ended Britain sending their extra prisoners to us. No, thank you. We did not care to have them doing that. And as a new country, we could tell them no. Okay, so that was a problem then for Britain. And I can just imagine someone in Britain having that eureka moment, that epiphany, when they realized they could solve that extra prisoner problem and settle Australia at the same time. It's a win-win. Instead of sending extra prisoners to America, which was far away, send them to Australia, which is much farther away. Get rid of them. And yeah, they're not coming back. But they will also help establish a new colony. They will populate and work in establishing this new Australian colony for the British Empire. Well, that's a bonus. That's another win. So they worked on this plan and made it happen. So in 1787, their first ships went from Britain to Australia. It took a long time, several months to get there. It took 16,000 miles to get there, and not quite the most efficient path, not the shortest, but they had to stop a few times to get provisions, fresh water. And so it ended up being, wow, a long trip. Yeah, probably never coming back, those 16,000 miles, any of those people. None of them certainly had ever been 16,000 miles away from home before. Probably none of them had ever been 1,600 miles away from home. Could some of them have never been 160 miles away from home? Maybe even. All right, so 736 convicts sent away. And of course, they had to send other people in charge of the convicts, as well as some others who had maybe a specialty to help create a new world. Farmers, shopkeepers, something like that. So, do you wonder who these convicts were? What kind of people were sent to create the new colony in Australia? Well, Elizabeth Beckford was one of them, and oh my goodness, 70 years old. She was 70 years old when she was sent 16,000 miles away from home to create a new world. I don't know, that seems a little inefficient, but was she a big bad criminal who needed punishment? She stole cheese. Cheese. Maybe a big hunk. It was recorded as 12 pounds of cheese, but oh my, really? Banishment to Australia for that. Another Elizabeth Powley, was young, 22. She also stole breakfast. Looks to me like perhaps she was going to make breakfast. Probably her family was poor, and well, yeah, she stole. So what are they going to do to her? Well, they actually first sentenced her to hang for this, and then decided, oh, we'll be nice to her and we'll just send her 16,000 miles away to Australia. Wow. John Weishammer was even younger. He was just 15 years old. He stole some tobacco. Sentenced to Australia. So you see, these criminals were not your big bad criminals. They were not murderers. They were mostly thieves, and not bank robbers. They were mostly thieves who stole a little bit of something, maybe just food. They were generally, yeah, poor people who were stealing to get by. So I can feel some sympathy for them. Okay, still stealing is wrong, but not your big bad criminals. Maybe a little bit of a bias. They weren't usually English. They were more often Scottish or Welsh or Irish. And well, they were usually people who lived in towns and cities. So are those the ideal people to send to a distant land to start a new colony? I would say probably not, but that's what they had, because that satisfied their wish to get rid of extra prisoners clogging their jails. Okay, so they set off in 1787, and it took several months. And so by the time they got there, the new year had passed, and it was 1788. And they landed at Botany Bay, one of those places that James Cook had scouted out several years before. Hey, today's presentation is brought to you by Star Trek. Yes, Star Trek. Yes, I am a big Star Trek fan. And here's something interesting. In the original series, the original TV series of Star Trek, there was an episode about people who were genetically enhanced humans. And these people had tried to take over Earth, viewing themselves as the superior race, and they lost, and they were captured. And they were sent away on a prison ship. Well, not a boat, a prison spaceship. They were sent away, and of course things happen, and in the episode they encounter the USS Enterprise and Captain James Kirk, and things happen. Okay. Later, there were a set of Star Trek movies, and in Star Trek II, there's a follow-up on that, where indeed the leader of these imprisoned people is Khan, and the second movie is The Wrath of Khan, where Khan is played by Ricardo Montalban. Maybe, though, you know about the reboot of the Star Trek movies and a follow-up on this, kind of a redo of the Wrath of Khan movie, where Khan is played by Benedict Cumberbatch. All right, well, all of that I tell you because the name of the prison spaceship is Botany Bay, because the Australian convict ships landed in Botany Bay. Yes, in literature, in this case, TV and movies, the term Botany Bay has become associated with prisoners. From now on, yes, if you see this reference to Botany Bay, you're reading a story, you're watching a TV show, and Botany Bay is mentioned, know that it means prisoners, convicts. Which is actually a little bit ironic, because the British did not stay at Botany Bay. Fairly quickly, they decided that Jackson Bay was better, and they went a short distance to Jackson Bay and established their settlement. And that became Sydney, now the biggest city of Australia. Well, another quirky thing is that a few days later, French ships arrived. French ships arrived, the La Pérouse expedition. And this was greatly puzzling to the British. Why are you French here? What's going on? Well, the French were not there to establish a colony. The French were there sailing, trying to, notably, go all the way around the world. to go all the way around the world. Now, usually when we say who was the first to go all the way around the world, we say Ferdinand Magellan. And that is sort of true, because Magellan on his voyage actually died in the Philippines. But members of his crew continued the voyage and did, in fact, go all the way around the world. So we can say the Magellan expedition did go all the way around, and they were the first to do so. Lapérouse, they were trying to do the same thing. They landed on Australia to get provisions and fresh water, and then they left again, and no one ever heard from them again. So they failed. My imagination says they're on the bottom of the Indian Ocean, somewhere there. Speaking of going all the way around places, notice that here we have the first to go all the way around Tasmania. George Bass, captaining for the British, goes all the way around Tasmania. And in doing so, he gets his name on the map. You can see in the small print, it says there Bass Strait. So that narrow passageway between Tasmania and mainland Australia is the Bass Strait. But the more significant going all the way around is that Matthew Flinders circumnavigates Australia. He's the first. He's going also for the British, going all the way around. So his voyage of 1802 to 1803 goes all the way around. And we now know, they first know how big Australia actually is. So this is a big moment, yes. Okay, but the British really like this idea of the convicts. So they keep sending the convicts to that east side, Sydney, okay, other spots. And then in 1803 and 1804, they start sending people to Hobart. Now, Hobart is the city of Tasmania. So I think this is kind of appropriate. They initially sent prisoners to this far distant land, Australia. What is Australia's own distant land or isolated place? Australia's own isolated place is Tasmania. So now the British are sending prisoners to their isolated place's own isolated place, Hobart in Tasmania. And then in 1826, they start sending people to Perth, prisoners to Perth, and this is on the west side. Everything else had been on the east side, and now Perth on the west side. And someone for Britain has a realization here. They say, okay, look, we've now settled on the east side. Now we're settling on the west side. What is in between? Well, let's think, what is in between? A lot of it we call the outback. There's several desert areas. There's other areas that maybe are not technically quite deserts, but are still rugged and dry. There's a lot of empty space. There's no big cities. There are no cities at all in between. What is there? An empty space. Okay, who is there? Well, there are a variety of the native peoples. The Aboriginal peoples or Aborigines, yeah, they have spread out through much of Australia, sure, by then. So there's a variety of native peoples in the middle. None too densely populated because, again, it's a very rugged setting. Okay, but who are those native peoples? Now I go back to what William Dampier said. They're the miserablest people in the world. So the British say, no one there, nothing important. So we will take all of it. We have the right side, east side. Now we're adding Perth, the west side. What's in the middle? Empty space. Who's in the middle? Nobody that matters. take all of it. And they claim this using a legal principle called terra nullius. Terra meaning land or earth, null meaning empty or zero. So basically empty land. Because the land is empty and they've got both sides of it, they claim all of it. Well, it's kind of harsh because there were people there, but there's Dampier's assessment that they're the misogynist people in the world. What if Dampier had called them great, skilled, talented people who mixed well in their rugged environment? Would Britain then have said, oh, there's nobody there, we'll just take it all? Who knows? We don't know. They did take it all. Well, they started with the convicts, and they had about 160,000 convicts coming to Australia then. But of course, other people come too, and others with different motivations. There was a time when a number of Chinese people came to work there. Work on the railroad was one thing. But probably the biggest thing was the gold rush in the middle of the 19th century. Well, in America, we have had our own gold rushes. There was the California gold rush. South Dakota had a gold rush. Alaska had a gold rush. Yeah, it's a pretty similar process that happened in Australia. Somebody found gold and got rich, and news got out. And so lots of people thought, hey, maybe that could be me. Maybe I could go there and get really rich. So a lot of people go out to try, and a few of them succeed. They find a rich vein of gold, they tap it, and yes, they make a lot of money. Some people do okay. They find a little bit of gold and they're fine. Other people find no gold at all, but now they're a 16,000-mile voyage away from home. And they didn't succeed in the gold rush. They don't have money, probably can't afford to go back home, and maybe decide why even bother. So they stay in Australia. They become workers. They become people who work in a factory. They become food service workers. They work on a farm. Well, whatever. They get jobs and they stay in Australia. So it's quite a few more people, about 600,000, who come out for the gold rush than who originally came as convicts. But it was that convict settlers who were the first big flow of people. Quite a lot of people came in the 1900s from, well, a variety of different places. Still, the main connection is back to Britain, but somewhat like America, Australia has quite a few different nationalities, ethnic groups, racial groups of people there. So that Australia now has about 24 million people. And there are some now who wonder, too many? Is this population actually too many? I would say not yet, but it's a legitimate question. And it is because of the land. The land is rugged and dry. The land does not have unlimited water. And if Australia were to grow rapidly, they may well have, significant water shortages. I guess it's good that Australia is not growing rapidly. They're in stage 4 of our demographic transition with low birth rates and low death rates. So they have a slight population increase. Of those, some are still native peoples, but that number is not too large. We think that when the Europeans first arrived, there were about 300,000 Aboriginal peoples, and now about double that size. So it's doubled, but it took a long time to do that. Part of that slow growth, I would say, is, many are still living in the interior where you cannot have a large population. So their slow growth fits the environment. Partly, I would say there's discrimination. Yes, the original peoples do often face discrimination in Australia, sometimes even in not counting them for things like censuses, and in other kinds of social ways. So I should note for you one major event in Aboriginal history of modern Australia, and that was a court case called the Mabo case. And it refers to a small island, Mir Island, there in the Torres Strait. Remember the Torres Strait between Papua New Guinea and Australia. In the 1970s, the native peoples of Mir Island, kind of accidentally, discovered that they did not own the island, that the Australian government owned the island. This was shocking to the natives there because no one else had ever lived there. It was always this native group who had lived there. No white people had ever lived there. How could the Australian government own the island? Australia said, well, Britain, it was part of the British colony of Australia. And so when we became independent, we inherited everything, including Mir Island, from the British. The natives said, well, how did the British get? They were never here either. All right, so the native peoples filed a court case claiming that they should have legal title and own their own island. And they won. And they did get ownership of their island. This prompted other court cases and then legislation to try to make a process established for these sorts of claims. And that was useful. Basically, the idea was that the natives needed to show that they had been there for a long time and that the land was not significantly developed. If a lot of money had been spent developing the land, the government felt they could not return it, take it away from the current owners to return it to the native peoples. For instance, one group did request downtown Brisbane should go back to the natives. Well, it already had buildings, tall office buildings, and so no, they did not return that. But there were quite a few lands that were not substantially developed, and yes, the natives could show that they'd been there forever, basically, and they did get many lands back. All right, late exploration and settlement. Isolation led to late exploration and settlement. So last time I asked you to answer this question in the chat. Let's answer it again now in the chat. Who got there first? Put your answer in the chat now. This will be help for creating attendance for the day. Who got there first? Okay, good. I see the answers piling up in the chat. All right, so the answer to that was A, natives from New Guinea and Indonesia. This was another chat question last time, so here's another one. Put your answer in the chat here. A little harder, but do we remember which of these were named for explorers? So the question is, which one is not then? Four are named for explorers. Which one is not named for an explorer? Put your answer in the chat. Again, we're not worrying whether you're right or wrong. You do not lose points for chat questions. But if you get it wrong, we'll tell you the answer and you'll be mentally prompted to remember that in the future. Okay, so the Torres Strait was named for Luis Valles de Torres, captain who sailed through that gap between Australia and Papua New Guinea. The Bass Strait, we said today, was named for George Bass, the British captain between Tasmania and mainland Australia. Tasmania itself was named for Abel Tasman, the Dutch explorer, and the Cook Strait named for James Cook, the British sea captain, between the big islands of New Zealand. So the one that's left is Victoria. Victoria was not named for an explorer, but was named for the British Queen, the famous Queen Victoria. All right, and you don't have to answer this one. Last time we decided this was true. A strait is a narrow passageway of water between two large land masses, and we just saw several named for explorers. And you don't have to answer this one because we know now it's convicts, right? The main group of first British settlers of Australia were convicts. Okay, but I would like you to know this acronym because this acronym can help you remember then this topic of today. Isolation, settlement, late exploration. Make an acronym out of that, you get ISLE. ISLE is another word for island, and that's very common in the Pacific realm. So think of islands in the Pacific realm, think of ISLE, think then of the words for the acronym. Isolation, settlement, late exploration. And that should help you remember this thing number one that everybody should know about Australia. Isolation, settlement, late exploration, ISLE. All right, I said that I would eventually have for you 3 things everybody should know about Australia. I do, and so that was number 1. Let's now find thing number 2. Thing number 2 is the physical geography of Australia. And that too has a preview question. Which words best describe Australia's physical landscape? Which of those is the best description of Australia's physical landscape? Again, throw your answer up there in the chat. Okay, so certainly D is tempting because dry, yes. Mountainous, we just talked about the Great Dividing Range. But I'm not going to go along with mountainous really because there aren't that many mountains and the Great Dividing Range is low. So I'm going to say that's the second best answer, dry and mountainous. I actually prefer number A, letter A, ancient and stable. So my second thing about Australia is ancient and stable. Australia's isolation is linked to its physical geography, giving it an ancient and stable landscape. Yes, here I'm going to argue that Australia's isolation, and its ancient and stable landscape are linked together. There's a relationship, a cause with those two. Okay, ancient and stable landscape. And the reason for this connection between isolation and ancient stable landscape is continental drift. Now, continental drift is kind of a bizarre idea, and it was first published. There had been some discussion of this idea before this book came out, but Alfred Wegener, a German scholar, was the first to publish this idea of continental drift. In this book, The Origin of Continents and Oceans, it came out in the 19-teens, so it's just over 100 years ago. Wegener argued that the continents must have been in other places at different points in history, and thus must be able to move. Now, that seems pretty weird because these are enormous pieces of land. How could they move? But Wegener had some evidence even 100 years ago. And he suggested that at some point in history, the continents must have been in a different place. Indeed, that South America, Africa, and Australia have evidence of being close together. For instance, there are fossil records from South America, Africa, and Australia of the same species. And not a bird that could fly from one place to another, not a fish, but a land-based species in South America and Southern Africa and Australia. How could this land-based species be in all three unless they were close together, linked sometime in the past? Okay, he had other evidence, similar sorts of things that suggested that the continents must have been in other places sometime back in history. Now, at that point, 100 or so years ago, he couldn't explain very well why or how the continents move. We have better science and technology now, and we can do somewhat better in explaining that gravity actually helps. Thermal currents in the Earth's mantle seem to help. Seafloor spreading in the Atlantic Ocean seems to help. Okay. But today I'm not worried too much about those. But I am saying, yes, continental drift made a difference for Australia. So here are the tectonic plates, these large or enormous, sometimes, plates of the Earth's crust that move around really slowly, inch, 2, 3, a few inches a year. Okay, so notice the Indo-Australian plate there where Australia sits. And notice all the red lines on the map where the different continental pieces, all the different tectonic pieces come together. These red lines, the edges, are very important. Things happen at the edges. So one possibility is that there are two continental pieces, tectonic plates, two continental pieces that are sort of, I like to view it that way. They are pushing against each other. And somehow that has to be released, and the release is up. Now, we might get an earthquake from this, but we can get mountains from this as the Earth is thrust upward. The world's highest mountains, the Himalaya mountains, are created from this process. So how about Australia? Does Australia have any red lines of continent versus continent? No. So that's strike one for Australia. Of the world's largest mountain building processes, continent versus continent, no, Australia does not have that. Another possibility is continental versus oceanic. Some of the tectonic plates have water on top of them, have ocean on top of them. Of course, there is still land at the bottom. So in that case, the process is a bit different. It's called subduction. One piece slides under the other piece. The sliding is rough. It also may create earthquakes. It creates a lot of friction, which creates a lot of heat, which can melt rock material. The rock material may move upwards in molten flows and may create volcanoes. Here you can see the illustration shows a continental land piece and a string of volcanoes from this process. How about this for Australia? Does Australia have the red line of a continental piece meeting an oceanic piece? No. Strike two for Australia. A second of the world's biggest mountain builders? No, doesn't have that either. The third possibility is an ocean piece meeting an ocean piece. And again, the land's below that water doing so. It's still subduction because one of those pieces still slides under the other. But in this case, the volcano doesn't come up on the land because there is no land there, it's ocean. And so the piece creates a volcanic island. Okay, volcanic island. And we have a number of these in the Pacific realm. Does it work for Australia? Does Australia have two ocean pieces lining? No, it does not. So that's strike 3 for Australia. So the 3 biggest mountain building processes in the world are these 3 just named, and Australia has 0 of them. There are still other physical geographic ways that mountains are created. They are usually smaller mountains. And okay, Australia has a few of those smaller mountains. Mountains can change the landscape dramatically, of course, and volcanoes for sure can actively be changing the landscape. No, not so for Australia. Stable. These kind of mountain building things change the landscape. Not happening in Australia, so it's stable. Look nearby, though, to New Zealand. It's a little bit hard to see on the map because the red line goes right through New Zealand. But you know where New Zealand is relative to Australia. So we go southeast from Australia, we see New Zealand, and the red line goes right there on New Zealand. Yes, New Zealand does have active mountain builders, including volcanoes, because it is on the red line. Oh, hey, today this presentation is brought to you by T-Mobile Hotspot. Well, because the hotspot is another thing here. And Hawaii was built by the hotspot. At first, we think maybe it's what I've just described about tectonic plates and subduction, creating volcanic islands. But Hawaii is actually different. And it is this unusual feature called the hotspot. What happens in the hotspot is that there's a weakness in the Earth's mantle, and molten material is released through that weakness. And because this one happens to be in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, we get a volcanic island being built up there. However, after a while, and a while is usually hundreds of thousands of years, the hotspot seals up, naturally closes off. But continental drift is still happening. So that island that was built, that volcanic island that was built, stops growing because the hotspot seals, but because of continental drift, it moves along. However, the hotspot is still back here. The island moved over, but the hotspot is still here. So later, maybe hundreds of thousands of years, the hotspot opens up again. And we get another volcanic island. And maybe, again, much later, the hotspot seals up. But continental drift continues on, and now 2 islands move over. But the hotspot stays here. And later opens up again and builds another island. So you can get a string of islands, which is what Hawaii is, a string of volcanic islands, because of the hotspot there. So we can look at the Hawaiian Islands and we can do tests to see how old the rocks are. And we can then quite clearly see the direction of the plate, of the tectonic plate. So Kauai is one of the oldest ones here, the oldest of the sizable islands there, at 3 to 5.5 million years of age. The big island, Hawaii, is the newest one, still growing some and only up to 750,000 years old. Okay, so Hawaii is the hotspot exception to the pattern. All right, so continental drift put Australia in the middle of its tectonic plate so that the edges don't affect Australia at all, and thus no big mountains, no volcanoes for Australia. Continental drift also created deserts for Australia. Now, just like there are mountain building processes in the world, there are different ways that deserts are created. Desert building processes. The number one, the biggest way to create deserts, it's called the 30-degree latitude process. Latitude measures how far we are north or south of the equator. So we're looking for areas at or near 30 degrees north latitude or at or near 30 degrees south latitude. So how does this work? Well, let's take the globe and let's look at the extremes. The extremes are going to be the poles, which are 90 degrees north latitude and 90 degrees south latitude, and the equator, which of course is 0. The equator, always hot. Okay, we know that. Hot air is volatile. Hot air wants to move around and often wants to rise. Remember what we've just said about rising air. Rising air always cools and can then often lead to precipitation. Well, the equator regularly has precipitation. That's some places you can almost set your clock each day by when it's going to start raining. Equatorial areas and areas near the equator get fairly regular rainfall. Okay, and that volatile air is moving up, which means there's less air pressure. Air's moving up, pushing down less air pressure. In contrast, the poles, of course, are always cold. Cold air tends to sink, push down. Sinking air is not volatile. Sinking air tends to stay in the same place. Sinking air is higher air pressure and does not generally produce precipitation. The poles do not get much precipitation. They tend to stay frozen, of course. So there's still a lot of ice and snow there, but don't get a lot of new stuff. Okay. All right. So those are the extremes. Now, 90, 60, 30, 0, 30, 60, 90 are what I call the mid-major zones. Well, the 30s and 60s are the mid-major zones in between. And we see that these rotate. That is, they go from high to low. So high at 90, low at 60, high at 30, low at 0. Those are the mid-major patterns. There are reasons for these too. We don't need to get into them for this point today, but notice that at either 30 degrees north latitude or 30 degrees south latitude, we have high air pressure. And again, high air pressure is pushing down and not generally leading to precipitation. So if we looked at a world map, we would find that many of the world's major deserts are at or near 30 degrees latitude. The Sahara Desert, the world's largest desert, yeah, right there, at and near 30 degrees north latitude. Okay, some of our country, the American Southwest, at and near 30 degrees north latitude. And for our purposes today, Australia, yes, well, the 30-degree south latitude line goes right through Australia. And continental drift for ages and ages and ages has been drifting Australia right on that 30-degree line. Okay, it's kind of like a ball with a wire through it, and that ball just slides on that wire and stays on that big desert building location. Well, deserts are one of the more stable landscapes we have in the world. Now, there's some erosion from wind, but deserts tend to stay largely the same. In contrast, for instance, water is a great creator of erosion, but that's what you're missing in the desert, water. Deserts tend to be stable. In this case, deserts are ancient because Australia has been on this latitude line for a very long time. So we have Australia without much in terms of mountains and certainly not volcanoes, and we have deserts being the major landscape. These are ancient and stable landscapes then. While talking about the landscapes, though, I'd like to highlight one extra curious factor about Australia. And there is a chapter in your textbook about this too. It's the monolith. Mono, referring to singular, a single thing, and lith to lithosphere, or the world's surface, the Earth's surface. So this is a singularity on the Earth's surface. And the most famous one is Uluru. That's the native name for the place. Now, when the British colonized Australia and eventually, explored the interiors of Australia too, they came across this place and they gave it a name, Ayers Rock. But this is also one of the places that the natives regained ownership of. And so it's probably more appropriate to call it by the native name again, Uluru. And this is quite a striking location. So here's a visual of Uluru. This huge rock formation, bam, just kind of in the middle of nowhere, and orange reddish sort of color. It has a lot of iron content in it, and so this is kind of like rust you would get on iron metal. It's that same sort of color. If you can line it up with a nice sunset and you're at the right angle, you can almost see this, what looks like it would be glowing in the Earth's surface. Okay, Ayers Rock, or we should probably call it Uluru. Now, down the way from Ayers Rock, we have a set of monoliths called the Olgas. Well, again, that's the British name for them. Katatucha was what the natives called this land. And in Western Australia, we have Mount Augustus. Mount Augustus. Very similar sort of thing to Uluru, but not as well known as Uluru. All right, and if you don't want to go as far as Australia to see a monolith, you can go to Georgia. And outside of Georgia, outside of Atlanta, Georgia, is this image. This one is called Stone Mountain. It's gray rock, doesn't have the high iron content, but it has this remarkable stone carving on the side of heroes from the American Revolution. I'm sorry, no, heroes from the southern side of the Civil War. That's it. Heroes from the southern side. So Robert E. Lee, General, is one of them here. So this is a little bit of a curious place from physical geography, but it's a little bit curious too, or odd because of American history. In fact, in this lovely park at the base there, the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, used to hold rallies. It's been a number of years since that, but another element of America's racist culture, racist history. Nowadays, no, not the Ku Klux Klan, but nowadays during the summers, they have laser light shows in the evening at this location. That's more fun. Okay, so I'm going with the idea of the ancient stable landscape. And here is my acronym for that. ALAS. ALAS. Remember the acronym, ALAS, ancient, land, and stable. And then you can remember this thing number 2 that everybody should know about Australia. ALAS, ancient, land, and stable.